Alright, so here we are in 7.3c. So this is video 7.3c, probably our last video for 7.3. Chapter 7 is rational expressions. 7.3 talks about converting to a lowest common denominator, so that in 7.4 we can talk about adding and subtracting. So we got 7.3c. Now here's our 7.3c is more. We're going to convert a rational expression to a lowest common denominator. So here was 7.3a, here was 7.3b, this is 7.3c. We're going to talk about converting rational expressions now. So we're going to fast forward past everything that we've seen. And there it was the beginning of 7.3b. Essentially, what do we have to do to convert? We've got to rewrite expressions. We've got to, number one, identify lowest common denominator, factor our denominator, and find our lowest common denominator. Includes every single factor from every denominator raised to the highest power. Step 2 is now what we're going to do in this video. We're going to talk about the numerator and denominator and find out what's missing and multiply by what's missing from our original denominators. So here's our example that we did in 7.2b, talking about just numbers. So now here we're going to talk about finding our lowest common denominator of each rational expression, because now we have rational expressions, and then we have to convert. So we got to, really pay attention to what the instructions say. Find the lowest common denominator, convert to an equivalent fraction. All right, well, step number 1 is find our lowest common denominator. Find our lowest common denominator, lowest common denominator. We got to start by factoring our denominators. Factor our denominators. All right, well, my denominator is 2 times a times b. My denominator over here is 5 times a squared. So we've factored. Step number 2 says in our lowest common denominator includes every factor from every denominator raised to the highest power. Alright, so our lowest common denominator then includes every single factor. So we've got to list our factors. 2, we've got to list a, we've got to list b, we've got to list 5, we've got to list a, which is listed already. So we've listed every single factor from every denominator, and now we raise it to the highest power. 2 to the first power, a to the first power, b to the first power. These are already there. 2 to the first, a to the first, b to the first, 5 to the first, a squared has to be there. So let's make this a little prettier. 2 times 5 is 10. A squared, we'll go alphabetical with our variables, and there's our lowest common denominator. So there's find the lowest common denominator. We did. We got to factor our denominator. Then we list every single factor from every single denominator, raise it to the highest power, and there's our lowest common denominator. So step number 1, or the first thing we're asked to do, is find the lowest common denominator. Now we've got to convert to an equivalent fraction. So we've got to essentially say what's missing in each denominator. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, you know what? Here's my green fraction. 3 over 2ab. And here's my red fraction. 6 over 5a squared. And I've got to say now I'm going to multiply by what's missing in my lowest, in my denominator. Because here, here are the steps to rewriting expressions. Number 1, identify lowest common denominator. Well, we did that already. Factor and then list everything. List every factor from every denominator, raise it to the highest power. We've done that. Now step 2 is multiply the numerator and denominator by what's missing in the denominator. So let's go see what's missing in our green denominator. What's missing in our green denominator? Well, let's see. I've got 2. Because here's our lowest common denominator. I've got 2. 2 is there. I've got to have an a squared. Well, I've only got an a, so I've got to multiply by a. Sorry, you know what? Let's change that to blue, I guess. I'm going to go up in erase just to be consistent. I'm going to say let's be consistent. And let's go to blue. So I'm going to multiply by a down here, because that's what's missing here. What else is missing in my denominator? In my green denominator, I've got a 2. I've got a 2. I've got an a squared here in my lowest common denominator. I've only got an a, so I've got to multiply by a. I've got a b in my lowest common denominator. Well, I've got a b already. That's not missing. I've got a 5 in my lowest common denominator, so I've got to multiply by 5 also. So I've got to multiply by 5 in my denominator. But again, if I'm multiplying by this in my denominator, I've got to multiply by the same thing, a times 5 in my numerator, because then essentially I'm multiplying by 1. A times 5 divided by a times 5 is 1, so in the blue I'm multiplying by just 1. So let's convert now this green fraction to my lowest common denominator. Again, my target should be this, 10a squared b. So 10a squared b, and I'm going to put that down as my target. And I'm going to see if we get there. So now, if I take my green original fraction, multiplied by 1, essentially multiplied by what's missing in my denominator, I'm going to find, hopefully, that I'm going to have my denominator equal to my lowest common denominator. Well, 2 times 5 gives me 10. And again, I'm looking for just numbers first. I guess I could look for signs and then numbers and variables. So signs, positive times positive, should give me positive. 2 times 5 gives me 10. Variables, alphabetical, are a times a is a squared, b times 1 is b, and you know what? Multiplying this original denominator by what's missing in my denominator did give me my target lowest common denominator. So that's good news. And now I just got to multiply my 3 times a times 5, or essentially what's missing in my denominator, because we've got to, according to our steps, we've got to multiply our fraction by what's missing in the denominator, but we've got to multiply our numerator and denominator by that because we're multiplying by 1. So my numerator then becomes 3 times a times 5, or 15a. And there's my converted fraction. This fraction is this fraction, my original green fraction, 3 over 2ab, 3 over 2ab, multiplied by what's missing in the denominator, multiplied by my numerator and denominator. 3 times a times 5 gives me 15a. 2ab times a times 5 is 10a squared b, and this blue fraction is the equivalent of this original fraction if we simplified it. But it has the property of having our lowest common denominator. Let's do the same thing now. Convert this red fraction into an equivalent fraction. So let's make sure we got a squared here, because we don't want to forget that. So let's take a look at what we've got for steps. In order to convert, we've got to multiply our numerator and denominator by what's missing in our denominator. So what's missing in our denominator? Is there a 2 there? Nope. So we've got to multiply by 2. Is there an a squared there? Yep, there's an a squared. Is our original red fraction missing a b? Yes, it is. So we multiply by b. Is our original red fraction denominator missing a 5? Nope, it's there already. So that's what we multiply by. That should be a fraction. Or sorry, that should be a parentheses. Let's make it prettier. Alright, so we're multiplying by 2b. We're closing the bracket. And we've got to multiply by 2b on top as well, because we've got to multiply our original red fraction by 1. 2b over 2b is 1, and that's a b as well. 2 times b, 2 times b. All right, so now let's take a look at what we've got. Let's see if we've got our 10a squared b as our lowest common denominator, because ultimately we want to get both of these fractions in terms of our lowest common denominator. Our lowest common denominator is 10a squared b. Let's see if we got there. 5 times 2 gives me 10. A squared times 1 gives me a squared. 1 times b gives me b. And sure enough, by multiplying by 2b in our denominator, we will get our denominator to be 10a squared b. And now we've got to multiply just our numerator as well, because we've got to multiply our original red equation, or sorry, red fraction, red rational expression, by 1, which is 2b over 2b. So 6 times 2 gives us 12. 1 times b gives us b. And there is our original fraction, 6 over 5a squared, converted to our lowest common denominator of 12b over 10a squared b. And if we took a look at this fraction, this rational expression, we would simplify it. We could simplify it. The b's would cancel out. 12 over 10 becomes 6 over 5, and 6 over 5a squared is what we would have, and that's what we've got as our original fraction. Take a look at our converted fraction over here, 15a over 10a squared b. 15 and 10 would cancel to be 3 over 2 by dividing each one by 5. A cancels with a squared to give me just an a on the bottom and b on the bottom as well in our denominator. A and b in our denominator, 3/2, and sure enough, that fraction is the equivalent of that fraction. All it is converted into our lowest common denominator. So there's our conversion of our lowest common denominator. All right, so I'm going to leave this one for you and say, please, you do this one. And this one, again, a little more challenging. And to be honest with you, it's not real challenging because here's what we're asked to do. Again, read the instructions, find out what we're asked to do. Find the lowest common denominator, then convert to an equivalent fraction. Exactly what we did before. Find the lowest common denominator means factor the denominator, and then list our lowest common denominator, every single factor from every denominator to the highest power. And then after we've got that, we've got to convert. Convert means we've got to multiply numerator and denominator by what's missing. What's missing in the denominator? What factors are missing in the denominator? So those are our steps. Factor the denominator. Well, these are already factored pretty much. That's factored, and that's factored. My factors over here are 1 and x plus 1. Factors over here, x minus 4 and 1. Find the lowest common denominator. Include every single factor from every single denominator. Raise it to the highest power. And then multiply the numerator and denominator of each fraction by what's missing in the denominator. So that will be your kind of take-home quiz. That'll be your ticket to get into class tomorrow. All right, let's go to a more special one, I guess. I've got 3 over x minus 7 and 1 over 7 minus x. This one, in fact, you know what? I'm going to put this on pause. I'm going to stop this video only because we've kind of gotten to. I wanted to give this one to you as homework. We'll do the next one in the last video, in the next video, 7.3D.